So today we're going to do the first in a two-part series on forgiveness, starting with why should we forgive, and hopefully kind of lay the biblical foundation with the passage that Anthony read so well for forgiveness itself. And then next week we'll talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts and some of the struggles we have in particular. So today we're going to begin with this whole notion of the process of forgiveness, if you will. Corrie ten Boom was a Dutch watchmaker and a Christian who, along with her father and other members of their family, helped many Jews escape the Nazi Holocaust during World War II. In May of 1940, the Nazis invaded their homeland, the Netherlands. 2 years later, in May 1942, a well-dressed woman came to the ten Booms with a suitcase in hand. She was Jewish. Her husband had already been arrested several months earlier, and her son had gone into hiding. And the occupation authorities had just visited her home again, and she was afraid. And she had heard that the ten Boom family had helped their Jewish neighbors, the Wheels. And she asked them, begged them, if they might help her too. Corrie's father, Caspar ten Boom, an avid reader of both the Old and the New Testament, recognized that the Jews were God's chosen people, and out of his Christian compassion felt like it was their job to help these who were so persecuted. So he readily agreed, and the ten Boom family became very active in the Dutch underground, hiding Jewish refugees from the Nazi occupiers. Like their father, Corrie, and her sister Betsy opened their homes to other refugees, to both Jews and to also those who were a part of that underground resistance. In February 1942, a fellow Dutchman informed the Nazis about the ten Boom's work, and the entire family was arrested. A few were released, some of the nephews and the younger sons. Caspar, the father, died in custody 10 days later. And Corrie and her sister Betsy were transferred from one prison facility to another until they eventually landed in Ravensbrück, a women's concentration camp in Germany. There, Corrie and her sister Betsy held worship services after the long, hard day's labor, using a Bible they had managed to smuggle in. While they were there, Betsy's health deteriorated. And on December 16, 1944, she passed away at the age of 59. But before she died, she told her sister Corrie, "There is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still." 14 days after that, Corrie was released. Afterwards, she was told that her release was due to a clerical error. And a week later, all the women in her age group were sent to the gas chambers. Corrie could have easily left Ravensbrück bitter and defeated. But instead, she returned to the Netherlands following the war, and she set up a rehabilitation center in Bloemendaal. The refugee houses that she helped run consisted of concentration camp survivors, and they also sheltered the jobless Dutch who had previously collaborated with the Germans during the occupation. In 1946, she returned to Germany to offer the defeated Germans a word of hope and a message about God's forgiveness. It was at one of those meetings, one of those speaking engagements in 1947. She was at a church in Munich speaking in the basement when she saw him. A balding, heavy-set man in a gray overcoat, a brown felt hat clutched in his hands. Most people were silently following out of the basement meeting room, as they often did when she spoke in Germany, in silence. But this time she saw a man working against the crowd coming towards her, moving against the flow. Hear how she describes what happened next. One moment I saw the overcoat and the brown hat. The next, a blue uniform and a visored cap with its skull and crossbones. He came back in a rush. The huge room with its harsh overhead lights. The pathetic pile of dresses and shoes in the center of the floor. The shame of walking naked past this man. I could see my sister's frail form ahead of me, ribs sharp beneath the parchment skin. Betsy, how thin you were. The place was Ravensbrück, and the man who was making his way forward had been a guard there, one of the most cruel. Now he was in front of me, hand thrust out. A fine message, Fräulein. How good it is to know that, as you say, all our sins are at the bottom of the sea. And I, who had spoken so glibly of forgiveness, fumbled in my pocketbook rather than take that outthrust hand. He would not remember me, of course. How could he remember one prisoner among thousands of women? But I remembered him and the leather crop swinging from his belt. I was face to face with one of my captors, and my blood seemed to freeze. You mentioned Ravensbrück in your talk, he was saying. I was a guard there. No, he didn't remember me. But since that time, he went on, I've become a Christian. I know God has forgiven me for the cruel things I did there, but I would like to hear it from your lips as well, Fräulein. Again, the hand came out. Will you forgive me? And I stood there. I, whose sins had again and again needed to be forgiven and could not forgive. Betsy had died in that place. How could he erase her slow, terrible death simply for the asking? It could not have been many seconds that he stood there, hand held out. But it seemed to me hours as I wrestled with the most difficult thing I ever had to do. For I had to do it. I knew that. The message that God forgives has a prior condition, that we forgive those who have injured us. If you do not forgive others their trespasses, Jesus says, neither will your Father in heaven forgive yours. I knew it not only as a commandment of God, but also as a daily experience. Since the end of the war, I had had a home in Holland for victims of Nazi brutality. Those who were able to forgive their former enemies were able also to return to the outside world and to begin rebuilding their lives, no matter what the physical scars they carried. Those who nursed their bitterness remained invalids. It was as simple and horrible as that. And still, I stood there with coldness clutching my heart. But forgiveness is not an emotion. I knew that too. Forgiveness is an act of will, and the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. Jesus, help me, I prayed. I can lift my hand. I can do that much. You supply the feeling. And so woodenly, mechanically, I thrust my hand into the one stretched out to me. And as I did, a miraculous and incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder, raced down my arm, and sprang into our joined hands. And then this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. I forgive you, brother, I cried, with all my heart. For a long moment we grasped each other's hands, the former guard, the former prisoner. I'd never known God's love so intensely as I did then. But even so, I realized it was not my love. I had tried, and I didn't have the power. It was the power of God's Holy Spirit. Some of you have heard that story before, many of you have not. It's an amazing story of the power of forgiveness. And it speaks to this profound need we have both to be forgiven, and to be forgiving of others. As I prepared this week for this morning's sermon, I read dozens of incredible stories of people who managed to forgive others for the unspeakable losses they experienced at the hands of the very ones they were choosing to forgive. And as I read these stories and pondered which ones to tell, I found myself repeatedly drawn back to this one about Corrie ten Boom and that meeting with the former guard from Ravensbrück. And I asked myself, why? Why this story out of all the ones, some as recent as the Charleston church shootings a few years ago? But still, I kept coming back to this story from the end of World War II. And I think I did because it spoke to me in such a powerful way. Because in this story, Corrie ten Boom acknowledges how incredibly difficult and complex forgiveness can be. Even for someone like herself who devoted the years following the war to speaking on this need for forgiveness, forgiveness of others, and also forgiveness of self. And I appreciate the way it speaks to the reality that forgiveness is indeed a process. Sometimes a long and painful process, as opposed to something we can accomplish in the snap of a finger. For most of us, myself included, forgiveness is actually a work in progress. And sometimes it's a struggle that requires a lot of very hard work and a lot of emotional energy. For as Corrie ten Boom points out, forgiveness is not an emotion, but an act of one's will. Something we decide we're going to do, but not we alone. And I think that's important for us to understand. It's something we decide to do, but we don't do it by our own strength or our own compassion. And that's another reason I chose this story, because in this story she acknowledges that God is the one that makes forgiveness possible. Forgiveness is ultimately the work of God. In the passage Anthony read earlier, Peter asked Jesus, how many times must someone forgive? How many times must... I'm getting twisted today. Peter asked Jesus, how many times a person must forgive someone who has sinned against them? You see, it seems that Peter knows how easy it is for us to hold on to a grudge, to nurse that wound, and how reluctant we humans can be when it comes to offering forgiveness to those who hurt us, especially those who hurt us deeply. So in a rather magnanimous gesture, Peter suggests that we forgive another person 7 times. And actually that was fairly generous, because the Jewish law only required that you forgive someone 3 times and then you could move on. But Jesus, being Jesus, had another number in mind. Not 7 times, he said, but 77. Some translations say 70 times 7. In other words, Jesus is telling Peter not to assume that there is any limit to how often we are to forgive. That forgiveness has no limits. Forgiveness is not just a single act that you do and then you're done with. It's not a feeling or a thought. Forgiveness needs to become this lifelong process, a commitment you make. Something that is sustained over time, something that we may need to renew day in and day out throughout our lives. Forgiveness, Jesus tells us, is the key to God's kingdom. Because God has loved us, because God has shown us compassion and mercy, We are called to do likewise to those who hurt us. But that's not always easy to do, is it? Sometimes the hurt is so deep. Sometimes the offense against us so great that we can't seem to let go of our anger or our resentment. We can't forgive. We want to. We want to forgive. We try to be forgiving, but we can't. Countless times in my ministry, I've had persons tell me of their struggle to forgive someone who has hurt them badly. They're desperate to let go of that anger and that resentment because it's literally destroying their life, eating away at their soul. But no matter how hard they try, they just can't seem to forgive. They simply can't let go. It's as if they are imprisoned in bondage by their anger and their hurt. Life isn't fair. They're resentful. They want some kind of recompense for their hurt. They want the offending party to pay. At the very least, they want that person to show some remorse, and often they don't. And I understand that. Because at times I share those same feelings and those same struggles. But my own experience tells me that it's not enough to just want to forgive. And that retribution will never make things right. And that no amount of remorse will take away the pain or lance the wound that is festering inside. And I've also learned that forgiveness is not something we can do on our own. At least I can't. We can't will it or make it happen no matter how hard we try or how much we want it. But we can make a decision and a commitment to work toward that, to turn it over to God and let God's Spirit work in us and through us to accomplish that forgiven. Why? Because we are first forgiven. We forgive because God first forgives us, just as we love because God first loves us. So in this whole process of forgiveness, we start, I think, by taking our anger and our resentment and handing it to God. I don't think we'll magically be able to forgive just because we do that. And some people are, like Corrie ten Boom. But I think for most of us, it's where we start, right? We start with that commitment. Maybe a commitment to pray for the person who has wronged us. You know, it's hard to stay angry at someone and pray for them at the same time. Even so, we may still find it hard to forgive. But I think if we really work at it, that God will eventually heal our wounds. And then as those wounds heal, we will be set free to forgive that other. On our own, we may never be able to forgive, but with God working in us and through us, all things are possible. God has shown us mercy. And it is out of a life lived in gratitude, in thankfulness for that mercy, that grace, that we can in turn have compassion on others, even those who have wronged us, and can forgive those who have hurt us, sometimes very deeply. I think that's the why of forgiveness. It's all about God and what God has already done for us and now can do through us. And again, speaking from my own experience, I know that it's not always easy. And sometimes it takes a long, long time. And it may not end up looking the way we think it will. And all of that's for next week's sermon. But I want to say that if we persevere, if we are faithful, and turning that over to a God who is faithful, then God will free us to forgive. And then we can be released from the chains of resentment and anger that serve only to bind us and hold us back and keep us from being the whole persons God created us to be. This, I believe. Thanks be to God. Amen.